All right, go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for coming and joining this class on Introduction to Home Food Preservation, hosted by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. My name is Jess. I am a library services representative with the city of at the Plano Public Library. We're joined by Sahar, who's going to be our chat moderator, answering your questions in the chat, and Brittany from Texas A&M, if you want to say hi, Brittany.
Hi there.
All right, just before I hand it over to Brittany, I'm going to go over a couple of things with everybody. All of our virtual attendees are muted and I have their video blocked for this program. You're only going to be seeing the instructor's screen and Brittany during this presentation. At the top of the screen, you can find an exit full screen option if you need to get to other things on your computer. You're welcome to ask questions or ask for something to be repeated at any time during the program. You can do that either in the chat or in the Q&A feature, which should be icons at the bottom of your screen. And then any questions that we do receive and will be repeated out loud so that everyone can get the answer to those questions, unless it's like a tech support question. All right, and then a recording of this program is going to be available in a few days on our the Plano Library YouTube channel. So if you need to leave early for some reason, or you want to refer back to this information later, this will be available sometime very soon. All right, and I'm going to hand it over to Brittany so that she can teach us all about home food preservation.
All right. Hello, everybody. It is so nice to be here with you. I love food preservation, and I am so fortunate to have a job where I get to share it with y'all. I am the county extension agent for family and community health in Collin County. Every county has at least one of me, sometimes multiple. If you are familiar with the Master Gardener program or the Master Naturalist program, that is administered by AgriLife Extension. So we have a great relationship with the Plano Library, and I am so excited that they have asked me to present here with y'all today. So we've got tech support on the call. This should be easy breezy. I know they're monitoring for questions, but I want to thank y'all again for joining me today on Zoom. Okay, so I want to kick off just by talking a little bit about home food preservation programming in AgriLife Extension. So you may see Master Wellness volunteers out in your community. They assist us with programming. They do special events. You can teach food preservation programming as a Master Wellness volunteer. They do a lot of similar things that agents do, but I have this slide here just to kind of show what we do in the office related to food preservation. We also work with the Master Gardener program to teach curriculum related to gardening, and we know that gardening and food preservation kind of go hand in hand. A lot of people are introduced to food preservation through their interest in gardening. So if you are a Master Gardener or know a Master Gardener, this is going to be right up your alley. And we do train a new class of Master Wellness volunteers every year. They train from January to March, although we are considering moving that to the summer. We have our Master Wellness volunteers get back 40 hours in their first year, and they present a lot of programs related to food preservation. And Catherine Sieve, some of you may know her, she's in Plano a lot as a Master Gardener, is our Master Wellness volunteer lead for food preservation. So if you've got questions after today, talk to Catherine or I. All right, and I am going to change my share to a video, and I'm going to make sure that I share the sound. And looks like we are good to go. So let me know if we are not hearing this. I'm going to hit play.
You'll normally go to your county's extension agents to talk about agricultural questions that you may have, but did you know that you can also talk to them about food safety when it comes to preserving canned goods and those sorts of items? I'm talking to one woman who says it's so important still to this day and how you can do it safely. Brittany Martin makes sure her fresh produce does not get thrown away.
Home canned goods can be a really important part of your family meal. People can because they want to preserve the foods that they grow.
On top of being a Texas A&M County Extension agent,
So I grew up canning. I grew up entering my canned goods in the fair.
Martin is also food safety specialist, making sure you're always avoiding foodborne illnesses when you're cooking at home.
Safe canning is effective canning. So we have the information we need to prevent botulism and to make sure our canned foods are safe. It's nothing to be afraid of, but it is something to respect.
She's a big proponent of food preservation, like canning, freezing, and pickling. It takes time, chopping, making sure everything is sterilized and sealed correctly. But she says it's worth it.
And this is something that can be passed down. It's a skill, it's knowledge. Not only is it fun and pretty in your cabinets, but it's good for your family as well.
Because then you won't have to waste money if your food goes bad.
Food preservation is a skill and you have to practice it.
Even if farmers have a bountiful harvest, it doesn't mean those foods will be okay to eat for a long period of time.
Resources from different states, extension agencies, or resources from USDA, which are those research-based recipes, so you know the recipe is safe, you know the practices that you are being instructed upon.
So Martin's goal for the next few months, starting up a workshop in the community so you can bring this practice into your own home.
Lifelong learning is so important, and we want to help you learn the skills you need to improve the lives of you and your family.
Okay, I hope we are back to normal here. Everything looking okay on the
In
tech support side.
presentation mode.
Oh, okay. Let me,
Gotta preview the next slide.
oh, hold on now. Okay. Give me 1 second, everybody. So glad for tech support. Okay, we are going in here. And we're going full screen. All right, how are we looking?
Got the PowerPoint, it's not in presentation mode yet.
Oh, okay, I messed up the. Let me change my window. How's that?
That
Perfect.
looks correct.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so we are so appreciative of Nicolette Perdomo with Spectrum News for that feature talking about food preservation. That's from last year, but it has been really relevant as people take a new interest in food preservation. So Extension kind of got their start working with families and youth directly in food preservation and agricultural practices. So then we had community canning sites during World War II, citizens actively canning. Pretty much every girl and woman who was active with their extension service was involved with canning. Now we know that everybody likes to can, so citizens still work with their county agent to prepare those safe home canned goods with their communities. That's a picture from recently, and that's kind of what an extension canning workshop looks like. So we're going to talk about all methods of food preservation today, but we are going to place an emphasis on the canning process because that is what we have the most interest in. But by the time you leave this presentation today, you will realize that you are already a food preservation expert. So why do people want to can? Why are you here? Most people who are interested in canning, like I said, also love gardening. So they enjoy their homegrown foods. And this has not been my experience as a novice gardener, but some people are great at gardening and they have quite the surplus of homegrown foods. So what do we do with those foods? We have seen an increase in sales of home food preservation supplies, canners, dehydrators, etc. That really spiked during COVID. People were very interested in canning during COVID. And we've had a little bit of drop off in those sales, but for the most part, the people who started it have stuck with it. So there's still a lot of interest. We like control over our food. You'll see as we go through recipes, even home canned goods can still have some health concerns, but for the most part, they are recipes that allow us to have control over our food. And a lot of people have fond memories of canning, maybe with a relative. I have two kind of fun ones here on this slide too. Save money, question mark. Maybe we'll talk about what supplies you need and you can be the judge if that will save you any money. And fun. So I have a question mark by fun because sometimes people get into the class and they say, wow, this is a lot of work. I was expecting something different. But other people get in and they say, wow, I have enjoyed this from the growing process to the canning process. So fun and saving money can be subjective. So we know people are interested, but are there any benefits to preserving food? What makes people want to follow through with this process? We know that food preservation treats foods so they don't spoil as quickly. As quickly is the key word here. Food still spoils inside of a canned good, but it takes much, much longer. So raw products become stable so that we can use them later in a season where maybe they do not grow, allowing those seasonal foods to be available whenever we need them, even outside of the season. So when we talk about food being unsafe, what we're really talking about is the term spoilage. And that means the food is unsafe or unacceptable for humans to eat. Now, in our larger food chain, the system of food in America, we have pretty good processes to avoid food waste. So spoilage is unacceptable for human consumption, but with food packers and preparers, sometimes that can become animal feed or be recycled in another way. For home canned goods, we are trying to keep out those causes of food spoilage, like microorganisms, even the enzymes that are naturally present in fruits and vegetables to speed up ripening can speed it up all the way to where that food is no longer good. Of course, damage to fresh produce or if the food has become exposed to a microorganism that could cause foodborne illness before it came to you or while you had it, and of course, insect damage. So controlling as many of these factors as we can helps maintain the quality of our food. And when we are talking about food preservation, we need quality, safe food to go in to receive quality, safe food out of that preserved good. So germs are kind of a broad concept. When we are looking at bacterial and germ growth, we know that foodborne illness needs sugar and protein to grow. So you are going to hear a lot about acidity and alkalinity. So that is the pH of the food. And it goes all the way from 0, which is very acidic, to 14, which is very alkaline. So you don't have to remember that. There's all kinds of charts and books and extension resources that can help you. But what I want you to know is that in food preservation, acidity is really important, and it's going to determine how we preserve food. So I know you've all heard of botulism. That's an illness that we associate with canned goods, sometimes unfairly, because that's not the only place you can get botulism, and it is very rare. But we know that Clostridium botulinum does not grow well below 4.6 on that acidity scale. So foods that have a pH of 4.6 or lower are called high acid foods. So fruits, tomatoes, pickles, it's going to be a lot of things that you might have canned in a beginner class, or when you're looking at beginner recipes, you might see those because we know that botulism doesn't grow very well. So they're kind of good to get started with. Low acid foods, which are pHs above 4.6, are meats, poultry, fish, some vegetables, and those would need to be pressure canned since they are low acid foods. We also pay close attention to temperature. We know the temperature danger zone is 40 to 140 degrees, and the fastest rate of bacteria growth in that range is between 90 and 110. So some bacteria, for example, Listeria, can survive at temperatures less than 40 degrees, but for the most part, below 40 and over 140 are much safer zones. And when we're thinking about that zone and bacteria growing in that zone, how long does it take? It does take time for bacteria to grow, but probably not as long as you think. Under the right conditions, bacteria can double every 10 to 20 minutes. So it's important that we are monitoring all of these factors because we know that bacteria growth can happen quickly. Most microorganisms need oxygen to grow. And we know that when we are canning foods, we are removing that oxygen, but a few can survive without it. And we know that microorganisms need moisture to grow. So if you're considering drying as a method of food preservation, that is one where we're removing that water to try to prevent bacteria from growing. So we call this FAT-TOM. It's kind of an easy to remember term for us. Food, acidity and alkalinity, temperature, time, oxygen, and moisture. These are all factors that affect germs on our preserved goods. So we know we don't want germs, but how do we get rid of them or prevent them from entering our food supply in the first place? Anybody who eats food is already practicing food preservation. So if you are here today, you have already started food preservation. One example I like to give is if you buy a gallon of milk after this presentation, you run out to the store, you buy a gallon of milk, where do you go next? Do you go to the movies? Do you leave your milk in the back seat? No, we know that our milk has to go into the refrigerator. We may not know exactly how long we have, and we may have been known to push that timeline a little bit, but really within 2 hours, we'd like to have that back under 40 degrees. And I know that your refrigerator right now is set to 40 degrees or lower because we want to stay out of that temperature danger zone where bacteria can grow. So if you put your milk in the fridge, you're already practicing food preservation. Refrigeration and freezing slows down those enzymes that causes food to deteriorate. So refrigeration and freezing are tried and true methods of food preservation that almost everyone practices. If you want to go up a level, we've got jellies and jams, canning, pickling and fermenting, and drying. So canning is different from refrigeration because we're using heat to destroy heat-resistant microorganisms that can grow at room temperature. So we're eliminating oxygen, we're adding heat, but when we are talking about jellies and jams, we can use sugar and acids to lower that pH and tie up the water in that sugar and acid so bacteria can't use it. Pickling and fermenting uses acids to prevent growth, and drying, again, removes the water. So these are basically all of our options for food preservation. And when we are preserving food at home, it may seem like there's lots of rules for food preservation. And if you have ever been online and interested in food preservation, you may have noticed that there are what they call rebel canning groups who don't love the guidelines. They don't want to follow the rules. They just kind of want to get in there and do it. But we know that not following these guidelines comes with consequences that range all the way from mild stomach upset to death. So remember that cooking is an art, food preservation is a science, and food safety is critical. So what does food safety mean? It does involve maintaining a clean workspace, washing hands, keeping pets off the counter, all the things that we already know. But we also need to choose the right method of food preservation. Is it a high acid food? Is it a low acid food? How do I can this? What recipe am I using? We want to use research-based tested recipes. So where do those come from? Those recipes come from the Extension Service of any state in the USDA. There are cookbooks and other guides and books that provide recipes as well, and those may be safe to use, but we know that Extension Service recipes and USDA recipes are research-based and tested. I have a lot of people who say, I had my grandmother's tomato sauce recipe. I want to use this. How do I use this? And what we usually do when people call and need help adapting a recipe is we find a similar research-based recipe to replace that recipe with. And we use your grandmother's recipe for fresh cooking. So you can make canning recipes all day long and never follow through with the canning if you don't want to. So that's one place I tell a lot of people to start, and we will cover that a little bit more later. But wherever your information comes from, make sure it's from an accurate source. Remember that if we don't do it right, it won't always be immediately apparent. So it's really important that we follow the steps. So we're going to go a little bit more into detail of the methods of home food preservation. You may already know exactly how you want to do it, but let's talk about the other ones and see if any other methods stick out to you. So like I mentioned, refrigeration slows the growth of germs and organisms, but it doesn't preserve foods forever. We know that keeping perishable foods refrigerated slows down the growth of germs, and it also slows down the action of fruit and vegetable enzymes that help those fruits and vegetables to ripen. So refrigeration is only temporary. I know that many of us have had foods go bad in the refrigerator, not as quickly as they would have on your counter, but remember, it's only temporary. Freezing is the easiest method of food preservation, and there are people who freeze everything, and there are people who haven't tried freezing anything. But it's one method of preservation that we don't think about as often as we should. It's the easiest method. It's safe for any food, and it does not kill germs, but it does slow them down. So think of them as asleep in your freezer, but they will immediately wake back up when we return above 0 degrees. And people ask me, I've had this food in my freezer for a year. Is it still safe to eat? And really the answer is, as long as that food has been below 0 degrees for the entirety of the time it's been in there, it will always be safe to eat. Will the quality suffer is the question. So for instance, I have the top of my wedding cake in my deep freeze right now. Is it safe to eat? Absolutely. It has been in there since I got married, which was a long time ago. Is it going to be delicious? Probably not. There's a reason we haven't taken it out and tried it. So the food probably wouldn't taste very good. But remember, for frozen foods, we're worried about quality, not necessarily safety. As we get into canning and jams and jellies, we're really thinking the most about enzymes. So we've heard that a couple of times today, but they're important in food preservation because they are natural compounds found in fruits and vegetables. There's nothing you can do to eliminate them, and you wouldn't want to, because they cause fruits and vegetables to ripen and to reach their peak in nutrition and quality. So it helps them grow and mature, but they keep working even after that produce is picked. So when we are talking about nutrition and other programs, frozen fruits and vegetables are picked at the peak of ripeness, and they are frozen so that enzyme stops working. So I know that no matter how long my bag of frozen bell peppers sits in the freezer, when I open it up, it's always going to be the same because that enzyme is not working. If I bring it to room temperature, that bell pepper slice will start to decompose because the enzymes have started working again. So that does cause the produce to spoil over time. So if we want to stop those enzymes from working, all we have to do is treat it with heat for canning, and we call that blanching. So in your recipes, you are going to hear blanch. And what that means is that we are treating it quickly with heat. So what about jams and jellies? A lot of people who are interested in food preservation are really interested in jams and jellies. And this process, some people consider it simpler. I feel like it's all kind of simple once you get it down, but this is a great place to start. This is really popular in our summer camps for kids. Kids love to do jams and jellies, so that's something to consider if you've got kiddos in your life. This is really, really fun and might be something they enjoy. And it's kind of a science experiment too, because we're using sugar to bind with the water, which makes it unavailable for germs to use. So this keeps those germs from growing. So another ingredient that we use in jams and jellies is acid. That's lemon juice, but sometimes citric acid. Most recipes do use lemon juice because that's more readily available, but you may also see citric acid when you're buying your canning supplies. That acid does add flavor. We can taste that lemon juice or citric acid. And if you've ever tasted it or had a jam or jelly, it's kind of jam and jelly flavor. You know, they all kind of have that because they're all using that. And it also helps gel formation. So talk about a science experiment. It gives jams and jellies that gel texture we associate with jams and jellies. You can do freezer or refrigerator jams or jellies. You may see recipes for that. Canning is not the only option to create jams or jellies. So if you are a refrigerator preserver already, you're pretty much ready to start with a refrigerator jam or jelly. We do have to eat those products in a couple of weeks because remember, refrigeration slows the growth of microorganisms, but it does not stop it. So we want to eat those more quickly. And if we get our refrigerator jam or jelly down to a science, then we may want to consider long-term storage in a water bath canner where they can last up to a year. So that brings us to canning, which is kind of the star of food preservation, definitely the one I like the most. But when we think of home food preservation, we often think of canning. So we know that canning kills germs that cause spoilage and creates a vacuum that seals the lids of the canned good. Now we have two methods available, pressure canning and boiling water canning. If you remember from earlier, the canning method used is going to depend greatly on how acidic that food is. So you may hear people say or toss around online, oh, I don't like pressure canning, I water bath everything. Or, water bath is not for me, I'm going to pressure can. Really, it depends on the food you're using. So if not done correctly, remember it leads to food spoilage and serious illness. And we want to follow those proper canning methods. Pickling and fermenting are two great ways to get into food preservation. Everybody likes pickles, so it's a good place to start. And in this process, we're using acids to lower the pH of a food, and it makes it more acidic, which keeps germs from growing. Remember that botulism, which is the #1 foodborne illness we're worried about with canning, really thrives on that acidity scale. There are levels at which botulism doesn't grow, and that's what we're shooting for with pickling and fermenting. We want to keep those germs from growing. But remember, you can do this in the refrigerator. Just like the jams and jellies, you can make pickles in the fridge. But if you want to store them for a long period of time, you've got to process them. So in a water bath canner. Otherwise, we got to refrigerate them and eat them in a couple of weeks. And that may not be a problem. If you are making delicious jams and jellies or pickles, they may go really quickly in your fridge. But if you want to make a lot as a gift, maybe to distribute to others, canning is a good place to start. Okay. Drying is the oldest method of food preservation. We have literally been drying for 2,000 years, at least. So without water, germs can't grow. So if we remove the water, we have already done a good job of preventing foodborne illness because germs cannot grow. So some commonly dried foods that we think of are fruits, vegetables, herbs, jerky. And I am curious, let me know in the chat if you've ever tried dried foods at home. So at my house, we've tried jerky, fruit, vegetables, herbs. Drying can be a challenge sometimes. We want to make sure that we are properly removing that moisture because it does give the opportunity for germ growth. So dried foods have to be maintained even after we've removed that water in moisture-proof containers, or the water from the air will come back and rehydrate those foods. So I'm going to stop right here and see if we've got any questions in the chat. I can't see it, but I know someone will let me know before we go on to which method to choose.
So, no questions yet. It looks like someone raised their hand. Sky, if you want to, go ahead and put that question in the chat for us and I'll read it out loud. But Susan says she loves dehydrating.
Oh, okay. Awesome. I love that. Okay. So which method do we choose? This is kind of what I hope this presentation is going to do for you today, is which method is the right one for me? So there's going to be a lot of things that are involved in choosing. What equipment do you already have? What time do you have? This chart can be really helpful, but remember that there are going to be financial investments and time investments. So we got to take time to learn the process, time to prepare the foods. But the most important thing to consider as you look at this chart is, what is your family or you or your friends, if you're hoping to give these as gifts, what are they actually going to eat? So in my house, I love carrots. I'm kind of the only one. I could make 20 jars of carrots, but I know that I probably wouldn't be able to give them away because most people in my family are not big carrot fans. Pickles are another story. Those tend to go really, really quickly. But I want you to look at this chart. It tells you between canning, freezing, and drying what the investment's going to be for equipment costs, energy, preparation, processing, and the loss of nutrients. So when we are looking at it from a nutritional perspective, we may lose some A and C vitamins when we are canning or drying. But remember, just like I mentioned with frozen bagged vegetables you buy at the store, that's sort of at the peak of their nutrition. We have taken them at the peak of their ripeness, so we don't lose a lot of nutrients when we are drying or when we are freezing foods. Another box on this chart that I want you to look at is, does it look like the fresh food? And the answers range from somewhat to yes, but we know that depending on the processing time for canning, sometimes the food can look a little bit different or lose some of its color. So that is something to consider. But there are also lots of beautiful canned goods.
Perfect. So we got two questions. Which one you just kind of touched on. Holly was asking, what does canning and dehydrating do to the nutritional value of the food? Someone said freeze drying, preserve vitamins, etc., but they're really expensive.
Yes. So we have one agent in my district. We all kind of share an interest in food preservation, obviously. She has a commercial dehydrator because she also has a small business that does commercial dehydration. So they are flash freezing those foods. It's extreme drying. It is the coolest thing I have ever seen. It does not make me run out and get a loan to purchase the equipment, but it is the coolest thing I've ever seen. You can freeze dry almost anything, preserving those nutrients, preserving that flavor. At home drying options are a little bit different. We can, and I'm going to jump back here, we still do lose those A and C vitamins. They are fickle, they are finicky, and they are hard to maintain when we are going through a change like this. So that's not a deal breaker. You know, there are if you're eating only canned or dried foods, that could become an issue, but for the most part, nutrient loss is pretty small.
Perfect. So I have another question. Sorry. Any tips on storing freeze-dried products? Currently, my mom is storing them in glass jars or sealed bags.
Okay, that's a great question. I have some experience with that. We dried herbs, my husband and I, one year, and we did not get all the moisture out. I was a brand new agent. I hadn't practiced very much. And boy, were we in for a surprise. We returned to those glass jars and they had not been sealed well, and the moisture had crept back in, and it probably wasn't removed all the way to begin with. So it can be tricky, especially if you are in a higher humidity environment. It's even more important to keep that moisture out. So some people choose to use equipment that can remove all the air and place the food in kind of a plastic pouch. That can work. A glass jar is not a bad option. I would recommend a canning jar because you can put that lid on and seal it pretty tightly. but you know, it can be tricky. And when we're using a dehydrator, we have a better chance at removing all that moisture than if we use an oven. But that is an option we can take. So plastic bags, glass jars, those are all good. Just make sure we're removing that air as much as we can before we place things in there. If we're using a mason jar, we want to be sure that we are packing it full to try to prevent some of that air from getting in there. But that is a downside to drying, is that that can be challenging. But if you are not noticing spoilage over time, then you probably have a pretty good system for drying. Great questions. Okay, so if we are interested in canning, here is where we are going to start. So jars and lids, and I'm sure many of you use jars and lids already all over the house for lots of things. One question I get pretty frequently is, are all jars the same? And the most common types of canning jars have two-piece self-sealing lids. The lids can be flat and metal, and the ring or screw band is metal as well. The lids do have a seal underneath. You can hold one up and look underneath. It does have a seal. Usually it's an orange color. That can degrade over time. So we want to keep those lids pretty much one-time use only, but the bands can be used over and over. I do toss mine when I notice rust, or I transfer it to some of my more decorative jars that are holding screws or small craft parts, and maybe they don't go back in the canner. A funnel is not required, but they make the job so much easier. Remember that when you are canning, if you are hot packing, which is when we take hot ingredients and put them into a hot jar, everything is going to be really, really toasty. And especially when we're working with jams and jellies, it is possible to burn ourselves more severely than we might with other canning processes. So a funnel is a really, really good idea. And there's lots of packs of this stuff that are all going to come together, including the headspace checker. You might have seen me use that in the video. Your recipe is going to tell you how far from the top it needs to be. And so the little jagged lines on that headspace checker are a ruler, and they are telling you if you are reaching the top. Lid lifters also come in these kits a lot. We don't have to keep lids hot anymore. We used to put our lids in the heat as well and get them warm. And when we hot packed, we truly hot packed into hot jars and hot lids with hot ingredients. But we know now that we don't necessarily need a lid lifter, which is a magnet on a stick anymore, because we don't have to keep lids quite so hot. Plastic knife or a spatula for freeing any bubbles in the jar before they're canned. Remember, we want that oxygen out, so we don't want any bubbles in there. And you might sometimes see a jar wrench. Maybe not if you're new to canning, but if you are an experienced canner, you might have heard of a jar wrench. We used to make sure the bands were really, really tight on the jars. We'd use a wrench to do it. But air in the jar won't be able to escape when we do that. So I know it feels counterintuitive, but we actually only want those bands on finger tight, as tight as I can get them. If you don't allow that oxygen to escape during the canning process, it can buckle your lid or cause a poor seal on the jar. So that's one piece of equipment we do not recommend, is a jar wrench. So if you're hearing all this and you're like, I can't wait to save a bunch of money, this sounds so exciting. Take a breath here and let's talk about if preserving food at home is economical for you and your family. It could be. Do you already have the equipment? And one question I get a lot is, do I need a new canner? I have a canner, I inherited a canner, do I need a new one? And the answer is probably not. I do dial gauge pressure canner testing here at the office. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but I see canners frequently that are over 100 years old. They are safe to can in. They're really simple equipment, metal pot, metal lid, a dial gauge on top. So for the most part, especially with pressure canners, because there's kind of less parts, it can be really economical if you already have the equipment. Replacement costs for lids and jars. If you are home canning for yourself or for friends or family, really it won't add up too fast. Canning goods haven't gone up quite as much as other goods have in the grocery store. but you will have to replace lids and jars. Jars can break, they can get cracks, and we do reuse them quite frequently, but depending on how they've been treated. For instance, I had a canned good in my pantry that fell. It didn't break, it was fine. We ended up putting it back in the pantry and eating the food inside pretty quickly, just in case. But the next time I tried to can with it, boom, it exploded. It did have a crack in the jar. I didn't see it necessarily, but when I introduced it into hot water, that glass exploded. So I did have to replace that jar. But for the most part, you can reuse those jars. Do you have access to low-cost foods? So as produce costs rise, this rings really true. If you're like me and you get maybe half of a tomato every year on your tomato vine, canning tomatoes could be a little bit more expensive for me. But if you are a better gardener and you have lots of tomatoes in your backyard, that may not be an issue for you. And of course, remember that we want to eat the foods we preserve. So can I sell canned goods? It depends. We teach cottage food law classes here at the Extension office occasionally as we have interest, but the Texas Cottage Food Law is online as well. And there are all kinds of rules about what foods you can sell or not. So if you are interested in selling home canned goods, I want you to get on and read the Texas Cottage Food Law pretty carefully and make sure that what you are considering is able to sell. And a lot of it is going to depend on the pH value of your foods. So any questions before we get into canning basics?
Okay, so we do have a question from Shirley. It says, are regular pressure cookers different from pressure canners?
Oh, thank you. That is such a good question. So you may see some information online that talks about, oh, you can can in your pressure cooker. Sometimes we know those as instant pots. They are pressure cookers. Can you can in there? And the answer is no. A pressure cooker is very different from a pressure canner. Could you find a recipe online to do it? Sure. I can find anything online. Some people also say you can can in your dishwasher or in your oven. We don't recommend that. Pressure canner and water bath canner is the only acceptable way to can high acid or low acid foods. That's a good question. A lot can happen in your pressure cooker, but unfortunately not canning. So like I mentioned, we want to make sure that we are getting our information from research-based publications. The National Center for Home Food Preservation is maintained by the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Service, and they are the #1 place to start. That is what we recommend. So you can search NCHFP, and it should pop right up, the National Center for Home Food Preservation. But there are other options as well, including the So Easy to Preserve guide, which is updated every couple of years. Avoid non-research-based information. So we talked about grandma's tomato sauce a little bit earlier, but we know from surveys that we are not always getting our information from the most reliable place. So if you ever have a question, hey, is this okay? And you can always call me at the Extension office, or if you have a friend or a family member in another county with this question, they can call their extension agent. And if we don't know, we will find out. Remember that just because it's online doesn't necessarily make it accurate. So we want to be sure that we are using only recipes that have been tested, and we never want to alter or make up our own recipes. So these are all the different sizes of canning jars. Mason type jars are the most common, and many people use these jars for decorative or storage of non-food items. So you may already have some of these lying around the house, even if you haven't canned. But we have several sizes available, but we typically use pint and quart jars. So half-gallon jars may be used for juices, which is a little less popular than some of the other foods we've talked about. But pint and quart jars are most common, and the size of the jar does matter because it determines your processing time. What about non-canning jars, like a mayonnaise jar? The answer is technically yes. You can remove all the air from that jar, but they may break. So especially in a pressure canner. A lot of times they're thin glass to be economical, but they don't necessarily stand up to that extreme pressure and heat. It can also be hard to find rings and bands that fit on those jars. So while it's possible, the risk of breakage doesn't make reusing those jars the best option. We've got two-piece lids, a self-sealing lid. There's that silicone band I was talking about, and a screw band. We want to follow our manufacturer's instructions. And really with those lids, that silicone can degrade. So we want to use those within 5 years of purchasing. And remember, bands can be reused. Lids we only use once. They can go to other places in your home. For example, lids I've used previously for canning now cover my jar buttons. So it is possible to reuse those for other purposes, but not for canning. So water bath canning is definitely the most popular for entry-level canners. It heats our foods to 212 degrees Fahrenheit, but it does depend on your altitude. So there are places online where you can find out your altitude, and you will notice on your canning recipes, it may have different options. You may have to cook it longer or shorter, depending on what altitude you are at. Pressure canning heats foods higher to 240 degrees. Boiling water is kind of our limit on water bath canning. It only goes to 212. When we add that pressure, we can get up higher to 240 degrees, which is good for those low acid foods that need to be done in a pressure canner.
Okay,
And remember,
sorry.
go ahead.
There's another question. So it says, I saw a reusable Tattler, Tattler lid in the picture. How can you tell if they're safe or not?
Oh, okay. So if you are buying your lids as part of a canning system, that is okay. I do not use Tattler lids. They're not worth the price increase for me. They are acceptable to use. You can use them just like you would use another lid. And they do sometimes say those lids can be reused. To me, regular lids are so inexpensive. That's the way I go, but these are safe to use as well. Just follow your manufacturer instructions. Great question. So remember that the pH of food decides which canning method we're going to use. This is not a comprehensive list. This comes from the University of Georgia National Center for Home Food Preservation, who also writes So Easy to Preserve. So if you get on their website, there's a more comprehensive list. But if you have something in mind that you were thinking about canning already, and you look at this list and you see it, it can kind of tell you which way you're going to need to go. Water bath versus pressure canner. Tomatoes are generally canned in a water bath canner unless we have other ingredients like vegetables that would cause us to move over to needing to pressure can. Salsa can be canned with a water bath canner if we're using a tested recipe. So if we're using a tested recipe, follow their instructions. It can be really easy. But tomatoes do have that asterisk on there. So I'm not going to touch too much on this because it is scary, but botulism comes from the soil. And we find it in two forms, either spores or vegetative cells. So we know that spores are only killed at 240 degrees, whereas vegetative cells can be killed in boiling water. Now, we are, for the most part, not food scientists, so I'm going to follow my tested recipe. I'm not going to get down with a microscope and try to figure out if I'm looking at vegetative cells or spores. I know that C. botulinum is deadly, so I'm going to follow my research-based recipe, and I know that some of these are going to need that full 240 degrees. So for foods that we are worried about botulism, we are most likely going to pressure can. So that may impact the foods you choose to can. And botulism is a concern because a side effect is death. So carrots, in this picture, they kind of give you an example of how the spores can wake up when we use a water bath canner and contaminate those carrots. And remember that botulism is rare, but it is potentially fatal. So if you remember the potato salad outbreak of botulism from 2015, it started at a church potluck and killed several people. That person brought that potato salad with home canned potatoes in it out of the kindness of their heart. They were excited to share their recipe, and unfortunately, tragedy occurred because they did not follow a research-based recipe. So remember that botulism symptoms can happen 12 to 36 hours after we eat that contaminated food. So if you ever worry that that could be happening to you, it's important to seek medical attention immediately. There's also a great book, A Botulism Tale, that talks a little bit about it. And some people find that to be reassuring. You know, they feel like they have more information on botulism and that makes them a more confident canner. So a boiling water bath canner is really just a big pot with a rack. It needs to be deep enough that we can do an inch of water over the top of the jars while we process. And we don't want it to be more than 4 inches wider than our burner because we're not heating that water equally. So remember, we use this for high acid foods. So a pressure canner is a little bit different. It's a special type of canner that has a lid that we can tightly close so steam doesn't come out. We need that steam to raise our pressure. So this type of canner allows us to heat higher than 212. Remember, we can get to 240 with that pressure canner, and we use that for low acid foods. One question I get a lot is this safe for my stovetop? And the answer to that can only be found with your stove manufacturer. Sometimes they cover it in the guide to your stove. Other times you may need to call your manufacturer, but we never want to break a glass cooktop, so always double check. There are options. If you can't use your stovetop, you can use a separate burner that just plugs into the wall. That could be a good solution, but definitely talk to your stove manufacturer. The pressure canner has a flat rack in the bottom so that the jars are not directly on your oven heat, just like in a water bath canner. But it also has a port, a vent pipe for pressurizing, safety valve, safety locks. People get nervous around pressure canners. They worry they will explode. But when we are using a weighted gauge, you can see it here, they have a counterweight, or a dial gauge, we can see the pressure inside the canner. Especially if you have a dial gauge canner, we check that annually for accuracy. Weighted gauge, there's no need because the weight of that weight is always the same. For a dial gauge, we can kind of become uncalibrated. So we do check that. It can be really scary to hear a pressure canner heat up and you can be nervous, but the best thing to do is build confidence. So we do offer dial gauge pressure canner testing here at the office. We offer it every single summer, but we also do it by appointment. So like I mentioned, that weighted gauge is always the same, so we don't need to test it for accuracy on top of a pressure canner. It could be a single weight, it could be 3 pieces, but this type of canner has one vent, and it's the same one the pressure regulator goes on. So you may see some air being released, but your goods are safe. Pressure canners and cookers. So this brings us back to our question earlier. They are not the same. Pressure cookers are more inexpensively made because they don't have to go up to such a high pressure. They have less metal, they're smaller in diameter, and they use less water. So we are not able to get a pressure cooker up to the same temperature as a pressure canner. So these are some of the unsafe methods I mentioned earlier. I just want to kind of show you some of these pictures. You may see these online. Sun canning is kind of a new one to me. The sun obviously is not going to get that box hot enough the way a pressure canner would. So really be wary of these other options. Now, one thing I will say is you can prepare canning recipes all day long and just not follow this part. And they are safe to eat the way any leftovers would be in your refrigerator. So if you want to follow canning recipes to see if you even like them, that's a great idea. And then just throw those in your fridge the way you would any other leftover and enjoy. And if you love it, we can move on to canning. So this is one I hesitate to even mention because I don't want to get it in your head, but you may see information about steam canners. This is a pretty complicated method, and we use only research-based recipes in these, and we use water bath recipes for these. Don't rely solely on your instructions that come with it. We want to really rely on that research-based information, but you can find more information about steam canning on the National Center for Home Food Preservation website. This is a pure steam process, so a little more intensive than typical canning. And I have never steam canned, and I can pretty frequently. So this is going to be for really specific instances with really specific foods. It could be the method for you, but again, make sure you're following research-based information on that. We have touched on Instant Pots. Remember, there are no USDA recommendations for canning in a pressure cooker. So we are rounding the home stretch. We're going to talk a little bit about putting food into those jars if we do decide to can. I talked about hot packing. That is when we heat food for a recommended amount of time and put them in jars. We add a boiling liquid. Those jars are hot, and then they are sealed and set to the side. Raw packing is when we do raw unheated foods in a jar. We can pour boiling water, juice, or syrup over the food, but the food is actually going in cold. You do not have to decide which method to use. Your recipe will tell you. So it will tell you whether to do raw pack or hot pack. And like you saw in that video, I was using a headspace checker there, which is really just a little ruler. If we have too little headspace, food can boil over. So I filled my jar too full, and now I don't have room if it expands during the cooking processing. If I leave too much headspace, now I've got more air in my jar. And remember that microorganisms love that oxygen. This can also discolor our food. So if your food is coming out and your carrots are gray or brown, they just don't look vibrant like they did when they went in the jar, make sure we are really measuring that headspace, because that can result in discolored food. So how long do I process? This is all really interesting, but I'm not sure how long I have to do this. How much time is this going to take? When we fill those jars and they're ready to go in the canner, we want to be sure we're using the proper processing time. And again, this is not something you have to decide. It's going to be in your recipe. And there's all kinds of things that go into how they figure out how long to process. But what they're looking at is food, how big your jar is, and which canner you're using. Family recipes from previous generations often use an open kettle method, so there's no processing time there, and we do not recommend this method. So this is another reason we really emphasize those research-based recipes. And of course, we know the point of processing is to reduce the growth of those microorganisms. So we want to use that heat to kill that bacteria and push that air out of the jar. And as we're pushing that air out and the jar is cooling, a vacuum seal is formed. So that's why you see people poke the top of the lids. They're checking to make sure. That's not the be-all, end-all method to check, but it is something that people do because we know that a good vacuum seal is critical for long-term storage. If you have a jar that comes out and it just didn't seal properly, that's the one we eat first. We're going to start on that one today. So remember, check your altitude. Even here in Collin County, we have different altitudes depending on what part of the county you are. We have an altitude, and Cook County has a different altitude. So the recipes you're following in Cook County are different than the ones in Collin County. They do have to increase their processing time. So don't take it for granted. Be sure and look it up. Under-processing can lead to food that's spoiled or unsafe. Over-processing doesn't have that problem, but it might not be good. When we teach food handlers, we say, you know, poultry needs to be up to 165. Could I cook it to 300? Sure, but then quality is going to suffer. So this is a good balance between quality and safety. We want to follow those processing times. Now, this is something that can happen, losing pressure. So if we have a drop in pressure, it means the sterilizing value could be compromised. This could lead to underprocessing, so spoilage or botulism could be a concern. If pressure drops below that target, We want to bring the pressure canner back up to pressure, and we're going to start the time over from the beginning. Could this lead to overprocessed food? Probably. Will it lead to safe food? Definitely. So if we lose that pressure for whatever reason, we want to bring it back up and start that process again. So our jars are done processing. What's our next step? We're going to turn off the heat and let the canner, water bath or pressure, depressurize on its own. This is a really important part of the process. We don't want to rush it. We do remove the canner from the burner if the stove is electric. If it's gas, we just turn off the gas. But canners are heavy. So especially when we've got jars of food and they're hot. So we want to be really, really careful when we are moving that to prevent burns or other issues. So we don't want to move the canner if the jars will be shifted around or if we could lose hot water onto ourselves or other surfaces. So during that cool down period, the canner is depressurizing, and it is a really important part of the process. So we're all depressurized, we're good to go. What do we do with the jars? We do want to take them out very carefully because they are hot. So if we are going to open a lid, maybe we're going to have something, we got to take them all out. We're going to take this big lid off. Be sure we're doing that away from our face so steam is not a concern. We want to take them out one at a time with a grabber. Sometimes I see people try to go in with a towel. Your towel is quickly going to become wet and hot. So a jar lifter is really important. We don't want to tilt them. Sometimes you see people do that in movies. We don't want to do that. We want to put them onto dry towels or a cake rack or a cookie rack. You might have that laying around. And we want 1 inch of space in between our jars. That's all we need. And then we're going to leave them alone. For 12 to 24 hours, we are going to leave them right where they are. You will hear popping as those jars seal over time, but some jars, it takes a while. It can take a full 24 hours. So we want to be sure. And then we can test to make sure our lids have sealed. We're going to pop that top. If it gives us a popping feeling and a popping sound, those didn't turn out. But if they are flat, we know that we did a great job and that those are going to be good for the next calendar year. So with our traditional 2-piece lid, like I mentioned, we're going to press it with our finger. If it lifts up, no good. We can eat that right away. Throw that in the fridge. It's the same as any other leftover. But remember, even when you hear that pop noise, we want to double, triple check later. You can also tap the center of the lid with a spoon. If you hear a clear ringing sound, then you have a good seal. If you hear a dull thud, it may not have sealed properly. But pressing down with your finger is the easiest method. And we are going to store those in a cool, dry place. Your pantry is the best place possible. We want to use those within a year. So notice here on this lid, they have written the date. And that way they know, hey, if I reach 1 year from this, I'm going to give it to a friend or I'm going to toss it. Could canned goods be good longer than a year? Sure, right? But we know that that 1 year mark is safe and good quality. Your quality will start to decline past that 1 year. Okay, so like I mentioned, what if they don't seal? Sometimes that happens. It's not necessarily anything you did. It could be the jar. It could be how the jar was packed. It could be the placement in the canner. Lots of things can lead to a jar that doesn't seal. We're going to treat that like any other leftovers, but we also have the option to freeze it or reprocess using a new lid and a full processing time. So we typically don't do that because it is a lot of work to get that canner going and we don't want to do it for 1 jar. But if it's been longer than that 24 hours and you're still hearing that popping, just toss it out because it's been sitting on your counter for 24 hours. No longer safe to eat. Now our last slide here, when do we throw out a home canned food? Remember at the beginning of our presentation, I said you can't always tell if it didn't turn out or if there is something happening, but sometimes it's really obvious. So we want to throw out home canned goods if we're not sure if they were processed correctly. Maybe your neighbor comes to the door and says, oh, I water bath these green beans for you. You say, oh my gosh, talk to your extension agent. And maybe we don't eat those. Definitely we don't eat those. But you can also see kind of a cloudy liquid in there. It doesn't look the same as it did when it went in. It should look exactly the same as it did when it came out of your canner. It could have a strange odor. You can see here a picture of applesauce with mold, a jar that didn't seal after it sat on your counter for 24 hours, or a bulging lid. That bacteria needs somewhere to go. It has pushed the lid up, trying to make space. That's a bad sign. So at the 1 year mark, we want to eat those home canned goods or toss them. Or if we see any of the following, then we need to toss those home canned goods. So I hope that today has been helpful and that you have a good idea of where you want to go next in your food preservation journey. I am always here for you at the Collin County Extension Office. I love to talk shop. So give me a call or shoot me an email. Even with little questions, if I don't know, I will find out. I get lots of calls where they've got the canner on the stove and then it's got to be a fast answer. I can't always get to those, but I'd love to talk about canning. So please give me a call or shoot me an email, and I would love to answer any other questions that we have.
Okay, just a reminder to type the questions in the Q&A or in the chat. It looks like someone is saying, thank you. The information was interesting and informative.
Oh, that is so kind. I love canning. I hope that you guys find a passion for food preservation, however that works for you. Again, please reach out to me. And if you have a dial gauge pressure canner and you would like me to test your dial gauge, please shoot me an email. Those appointments only take 15 minutes. We do them here at our office in McKinney, but I'd also be glad to come to wherever you are. So please reach out if you have any questions about your canner or other methods of home food preservation.
Okay, and just more thank yous. Thank you for your time and expertise from Holly. That's really nice.
Thank y'all. We are so thankful for our relationship with the people in Plano and our relationship with the Plano Library. So I can't thank y'all enough.
Okay, it doesn't look like there are any more questions. Just a reminder that this webinar will be posted to our Plano Public Library YouTube page. I'm not sure when, but it's typically after we close out our webinar. So if you'd like to come back to this video in the future, you can do that on our YouTube. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop that recording. Right. Looks good.
I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting.
Perfect. Thanks, Brittany. That was great.
Thank y'all so much. I could not have done it without you.
It went so well.
Yay. I love canning. Y'all have an amazing weekend. I'm so thankful for your help today.
Of course. And just one more thank you from Sharon. It has renewed my excitement and confidence. So exciting.
Yay. I'm so excited to hear that.
All right. I'll
everybody.
see ya.